Hello, and welcome to the Stonebridge Podcast. I'm your host and publisher of Stonebridge, Peter Goodman. I'm in Berkeley, California, and here with me again today is Michael Palmer in Brooklyn, New York.
Hey, Peter.
Actually, sorry, Michael, I offended you. You're in Queens.
Technically, I'm in Queens, yeah.
Apologies to Brooklyn.
No offense to Brooklyn.
Right. So, Stonebridge Press is a book publisher. We have books on many, many different Asia-related subjects, and most of them have to do with Japan. You can find out more about Stonebridge Press at www.stonebridge.com, and you can also find us on Substack and on Twitter and Facebook. Today, I'll be talking with Marc Peter Keane. Marc is a landscape architect, and he is very well known for his contemporary Japanese garden designs for private residences, for company offices, and temples. And he is also the author of several books, some but not all of them published by Stonebridge. Among them are Japanese Garden Design, Sakutegi, which is a translation of Japan's oldest gardening treatise, The Japanese Tea Garden, and Songs in the Garden, which explores the connections between poetry and gardens. Also from Stonebridge Press are The Art of Setting Stones, which described as essays for the philosophical gardener, and I'm sure that describes many of you. Also of Arcs and Circles, which are essays investigating garden, nature, and art, and a recent title called Japanese Garden Notes, which is a beautifully illustrated guide to the visual ingredients found in most Japanese gardens. Marc is also the author of numerous articles on gardens and design in both English and Japanese, and in magazines such as Kyoto Journal, Gardens Illustrated, and Architectural Digest. Marc recently relocated back to Kyoto, where he originally trained and worked after many years in Ithaca, New York. And talking about Ithaca, I should mention that Marc and I both share an alma mater, Cornell University in Ithaca. Although I was an English major, Marc was a landscape architecture major, and he actually went out in the world and did something wonderful, which is creating beautiful human-sized landscapes for thousands of people to enjoy. So a very hearty welcome to Marc Peter Keane. Welcome, Marc.
Hi, Peter. Very nice to see you again. I'm Michael in Queens.
Marc, as I mentioned, you recently in the last 2 years, I think, relocated back to Kyoto, where you had originally trained, and then you were actually back in Ithaca for quite a few years. How did you get to Japan in the first place, then come back, and now you're back again?
When I graduated from Cornell, worked in the States for maybe 6 years, I decided to go live somewhere very different and see how people do things differently. I could have gone to Europe. That was kind of interesting, but I decided to go further abroad and went to Japan because the aesthetics there are quite simple, unadorned, beautiful. So I went there for a year with the intention of just staying a year, and that became 17 years.
As it happens.
You have to watch out for these one-year trips. Then I got a position to teach at Cornell for a year, which is a rotating fellowship. So I took that project for a year, and that turned into 17 years. So again, you have to watch out for these one-year gigs. And after 17 years in Ithaca, my son was grown up and out of the house and on his own. So my wife and I decided to move back to Kyoto. And that was just before the pandemic struck. So we came back here into what used to be a bustling tourist city. We came back at a time when it became emptied of all the tourists. It was very nice for those years in that way, that it was so quiet.
Now you're back, and how do you find that it's changed in the 17 years that you left? Particularly, I was interested in how maybe Japanese garden design has changed or is changing. I'm wondering if people are still kind of pursuing the classical Japanese gardens, or whether that aesthetic itself is shifting and the demands of your clients.
In a city like Kyoto, which is 1,200 years old, there are always aspects that are, in some sense, eternal, quite old, unchanging, and always aspects in all eras that are changing rapidly. And we see this throughout history. So here in Kyoto, over the last 10, 20 years, with regards to gardens, there are certain aspects that have never changed, and there are gardeners who continue to do the old style. But more and more people don't have the money or the land to install those sorts of gardens. The upkeep is expensive. So overwhelmingly, most new houses, most new residences anywhere in Japan, if they have a garden, they have something that's more like a Western garden, some lawn and a rose bush or something like that. Within the context of Japanese gardens here in Kyoto, one thing that's changed is the development of something called zoki niwa. So zo, the word zo means miscellaneous, ki is tree, and niwa means garden. So a garden of miscellaneous trees. Well, what does that mean? The expression niwaki, garden trees, refers to the black pine, the red pine, the camellia, the maple, the azalea, all the standard set of trees that are used in traditional Japanese gardens. The zoki, the miscellaneous trees, refers to a garden that captures the feeling of a deciduous forest, mostly the kind of forest that's in the mountains around Tokyo, the Alps or up around there. And that garden style has become popular, well, over the last 50 years, but especially in the last 10, 15 years, young gardeners making gardens for new cafes or galleries or homes use this zoki style, which is very light and airy and doesn't really show the hand of the gardener.
Well, I mean, it sounds like if you're trying to convey a sense of a broad forested landscape, that you would actually need some significant space in order to execute that.
Right. That is the skill of the Japanese gardener, always, to be able to compress the vast landscape into the space of a small piece of land. And especially for these zoki niwa, to capture the feeling of a young deciduous forest with some larger trees and many, many small shrubs and ground covers and perennial plants planted underneath in irregular ways, and then maintaining that over time so it always feels like a young forest, even after 5, 10, 15 years. That's the skill of the gardener.
It's not giving anything away to say that you were not originally from Japan. You're an American that went to Japan to study, and you probably know a lot more about Japanese gardening than just about anyone else in Japan because it's a trade, it's a specialty, a skill. Yeah. So involves all sorts of things. Did you get any pushback when you first got there about how capable you might ever be of mastering this craft? And what's the situation now? People, I assume, just you're there, you're a garden designer, and end of story.
Right. I'm often asked that question. My personal experience has been wonderful. I never felt anything like a pushback. I've always felt welcomed. And with regard to clients and such, in the beginning, all of my projects were introduced by an architect or a friend of the family or something like that. And in Japan, when someone introduces you, you are there not because of you, you're there because of the guarantee of the person doing the introduction.
Right.
So that idea of would I be accepted or not, that happened before I even got on site. I never really had to prove myself in that way. And over time now, my own work is out there, so people hire me directly. I don't really need that sort of introduction. But I'm fluent in the language. I understand the culture, quite comfortable here. So in my day-to-day life, I don't see myself as living in a foreign country or being among foreign people. I may be seen that way, of course, from the outside looking in, but I don't feel that.
And your commissions these days, are they mostly in Japan or are they abroad or a combination of both?
Both, yeah. I just finished a project in San Francisco and one here in Kyoto. I would love to have all the work I could handle within a bicycle ride of my house, but my work is fairly specialized, so I go wherever the work is.
What are those conversations like with your clients, say a private residence? You go there and they have, they haven't built the house yet, but they have a plot of land. Do they generally have something in mind, or they say, well, we're just going to leave it to you? What do you suggest?
Leave it to me, almost entirely. I do drawings and sketches and present that and incorporate a client's interests and ideas, but I'm being hired for my skill set and understanding. And the people who hire me are looking for that. So they really mostly leave the work up to me. In particular, of late, I'm working on these contemporary karesansui gardens. So the word karesansui refers to a garden that in the West is usually called a Zen garden,
Right.
although that's a bit of a misnomer. It's not a Japanese expression. It's a Western expression. But what a karesansui garden is, in its most fundamental form, the word sansui is written with the two characters mountain water. And mountain water was an expression that meant nature. Before the word nature existed in Japan, people said sansui. So a karesansui, the word kare just means dry. In other words, there's no river or pond. It's done without actual water. The karesansui is some sort of meditation on nature done in a very abstract sculptural way. What I'm doing is taking the traditional form of karesansui, using very much the same materials, the stone or gravel or moss, that sort of thing. But the concept of nature that lies behind the garden is not the understanding of nature from the 16, 17, 1800s, as in the traditional gardens. It's our contemporary understanding of nature. So, for instance, one of my gardens has as its focus tectonic plate movement. Another one has the concept of singularity. These 21st century understanding of what nature is behind the gardens that I'm designing.
Is that black hole singularity?
Yeah, that's one of them. Singularity is a word found in every science and every art, and it has different meanings in each one. But the black hole or the Big Bang, this idea of infinity coming down to a single point is the kind of black hole that I was working into the garden that I built.
Would you mind explaining in a little detail how you express that notion of singularity in the garden?
It's very simple. There's a field of flat stones in a kind of a fish scale pattern that looks very much like a field of energy, in the center of which is a single, rather small standing stone that makes a still point in this vibrating or echoing or rippling field of stones. The garden is called Still Point. And if you look on my website, you'll find the Still Point garden and you can see it.
Now, someone who is, say, you don't necessarily have to put a signboard up there and say singularity, see, reference black holes, et cetera, et cetera. You basically rely on whether they know what they're looking at or not. It in your mind, or maybe your motive as a designer, is that you're going to somehow capture that sensibility somehow and express it to the observer.
Right. So with my gardens, these karesansui gardens, I see them as having 3 levels of understanding, which are 3 levels that I've drawn from Japanese poetry. The first is aesthetic. So you don't know anything about the garden. You don't know the backstory. You don't know anything like that. You just happen upon it. You see it. And it has to be captivating, seductive. It has to stop you, pull you in, make you want to sit down and just be there with the garden for a little while. If it doesn't work on an aesthetic level, then it's failed. It has to work initially just as a sculpture or a painting. Then usually the garden has a title. For instance, this garden at Honenin that I'm building has the title Empty River. So you think, what does that mean? What does empty river mean? And that starts you wondering why this would be called that. So then you read the sign, the descriptive plaque, and you understand its meaning that way. So you enter a second level, which is the garden teaching you something about nature. And the third level, which I never describe in detail myself because it's personal, is that with all nature poetry, where there's some sort of natural theme in the poem, it could be the moon or a bush clover bush or a river, whatever it is. It's a poem about that piece of nature, but it's really talking about the human spirit. It may be talking about love or loss or hope or fear. So the third level of these gardens is when you start thinking about this concept, which initially is some concept found in nature, but you think about it more personally, what that would mean to you.
Well, that's interesting. The first stage, the aesthetic stage, is just to kind of to draw someone in, and maybe they don't know exactly why they're being drawn in, but they like what they see, so they sit and look at it. And then you have this kind of signboard that says, well, here's what it is you're looking at. But the third one, it seems, is the one that really counts, because it's the one where the person actually might say they get actively involved in the observation. They become almost a part of the thing that is being observed. So there's kind of a symbiotic relationship between the person who's looking at the garden and the garden itself. And the interesting thing about it is that while the second one in particular is more sort of the world, a literal statement, the third one seems so personal that everyone is going to basically get it on their own terms.
Exactly. Well, you made two good points there. One is if they get it. I understand that of the people who visit these gardens that have this sort of conceptual background to them, all of them see the aesthetics, whether they like it or not. A few will read the plaque and understand the nature meaning, and a few of those will have some deep feeling from it. It doesn't get through to everyone. I understand that, but that's the way that I build these. The idea of having these layers to the garden means that, especially for gardens that people can visit from time to time, each time they come back, the garden seems to speak to them a little bit more each time.
Right.
And that third layer, the personal one, I never try and say what that should be for anyone. I'm just hoping people kind of think of it in their own way. To give you an example, there's a garden in Manhattan called Thrust. It's in the inner courtyard of a new commercial building. And that garden uses tectonic plate theory as its theme. The mountain in Japanese art, Japanese gardens, is an extremely important concept. And the mountain, Yama, had various meanings in Buddhism, in Taoism, in Shintoism, various meanings that people throughout history in Japan used to understand what a quote-unquote mountain was. What they didn't understand is that mountains are the result of tectonic plates, two or more tectonic plates, huge plates with an incredible amount of energy moving toward each other, pressing against each other, and forcing an uplift at a certain point. And that uplift, whether it's volcanic or simply an uplift of soils and rock, that's what forms a mountain. So what a mountain is in that way is a symbol of a huge, massive energy in the ground that we don't sense except where we see it in the form of a mountain. So when you think about that on a personal level, what is that huge hidden force pushing against another huge hidden force that at some point lifts up and becomes visible? You know, is it a conflict between two nation states on a border? Is it a love between two people, kind of hidden love, where two people are pressing against each other, not physically necessarily, but this sort of desire to be with each other, and that at some point it rises up? You know, each person will have their own idea of what this massive hidden force is, but it would spark someone who's a thinking person to think in that way.
I'm kind of curious, is there no movement, say, among neo-Japanese garden movement, you know, a bunch of people getting together with revolutionary ideas, trying to think about how to spread the word?
How to take over the world?
Yeah. I mean, take over the world.
Change the world one garden at a time. Yeah.
You know, well, I mean, from my standpoint, it's kind of like, you know, if I'm in like London and I see a Japanese garden inside some museum, I mean, I appreciate it, you know, for what it is and everything, but I'm not sure it moves me to any kind of new place. And yet the sort of stuff that you're talking about are things that could actually kind of subtly insinuate themselves into people's consciousness and kind of turn their spirit into a new direction. There are plenty of people who are, you know, jabbering about this and maybe trying to do such things through music, but this idea of doing it through garden art on a kind of a large scale that is nevertheless, I mean, it's large, but it's still human sized. I can't think of anything else quite like it.
So in Japan, in architecture, there has been over the last, well, almost 100 years, but especially post-war, a huge outpouring of creative ideas. You know, some really wacky, many very elegant, but so much creative work in architecture and so much support for that. At the same time, those architects, by and large, were not interested in gardens. It just wasn't part of their building plan. Certainly old gardens, Japanese gardens, were considered passé, old-fashioned.
Sure.
So they didn't put those in. So the Japanese garden culture did not experience that kind of huge across the culture boom that architecture did. There have been a few, like Shigemori Mide, who did gardens with unusual blue stones and red stones and, red concrete and different things like that. But not really a great outpouring of very different, unusual creative work.
Have any garden designers kind of entered into collaborations with architects so they kind of feed off each other's energies or design ideas?
A little bit. Isamu Noguchi, who's not really Japanese, but of Japanese descent half, he dabbled in gardens a bit. And there are other sculptors like Nagare. He was another person with a studio in Shikoku, like Isamu, who also would do these installations. One thing you saw happening is that in the past, people used natural boulders as the main forms of the garden. But when you're working around poured concrete modern architecture, the architects didn't feel any simpatico with that kind of natural form. So they started using pieces of split granite, that were very rough and angular and contemporary looking, because they were industrial quarry pieces, that sort of thing, that may have drill holes through them in places, and that kind of very different feeling. So there are gardens that were made at modern architecture sites that use these split granite pieces instead of old weathered stones. That happened over the last 50 years.
But nothing like an international movement.
No,
like
I mean there are designers who do interesting or novel work. There's a priest in Tokyo, a Zen priest, who also does garden designs, who's quite famous. And there's some modern architects who have done fanciful garden-like spaces using stainless steel and panels of metal and water and things like that. But there's been no coordinated movement. There's certainly not like in the art movement here, where they had the Gutai movement, where people actually had a movement and joined on and did that whole social thing. That never happened with gardens or contemporary gardens.
Seems like an opportunity in the making.
I will not be a part of it, in the sense
I understand.
In the sense that I am allergic to organizations in general, and I don't join on, to any societies or groups or that sort of thing.
Don't worry, I won't nominate you.
Thank you.
Do you think of this as a particularly modern approach to garden making, or do you think the masters of the craft 300, 400, 500 years ago were as aware of these things, but simply lacked the facility or vernacular to put it into words?
They didn't lack anything. They had a different level of understanding of what nature was. So they were incorporating ideas of Taoism, Shintoism, Buddhism in the gardens, which was their way of thinking about things. However, this is true for all of these arts and religions. In the very beginning, people are experimenting and doing creative things and thinking about things on that level. But as time goes on, people start copying forms and it becomes cliche. So of all the karesansui gardens in Japan, and there's hundreds of thousands of them, right? In temples and residences and hotels and shops, all over the place. The number of them that are built with this sort of spiritual or philosophical intent is very, very, very small. It's become a rote form that people copy. But yes, the people in the past, of course, there were people who had that way of thinking and built gardens incorporating their ideas of what the world or the universe was. For instance, there's a mountain called Shumisen in Japanese. The Sanskrit is Sumeru. And in Hindu and Buddhist and Jain and Bon religions, it is the axis mundi. It's the central mountain that acts as a core to the universe. Their understanding of what the universe was that there was a central mountain around which were 8 seas and 8 ranks of other mountains, sort of like donuts going outward in space. And we humans lived on the most outward mountain range, very far from the center of the universe. That was their understanding of how the world was built, how the universe was built. And that sumeru, that shumisen stone, has been put into Japanese gardens for the last 1,500 years. It was one of the very, very first gardens to ever be built in Japan. It was built by a Korean craftsman for the empress at that time, Empress Suiko. And he built a sumeru, a shumisen form in her garden.
You may recall, I was David Slosson's editor on his book, Secret Teachings in the Art of Japanese Gardens. It was a wonderful book to work on, and David Slosson was a wonderful person to get to know. And one of the lessons that I learned from working on his book was the idea that what makes the Japanese garden, quote unquote, Japanese, really doesn't have to do with the vegetation or the fact that there's pagodas and bridges and stuff like that. It's much more about the design, the composition, the artifice that the designer builds into it to kind of play with the perception of the viewer. And it depends a lot on the viewer bringing to it, or at least the educated viewer bringing to the garden, some sense of culture and history that he or she understands. Your signpost is, of course, helpful, but if you're looking at a traditional garden that kind of resonates maybe with gardens you've seen in the past or your own instruction in Buddhism as a child or whatnot. So I remember talking with David about this is if you're going to Arizona and you've got a ranch and you've got cactuses and saguaro and mesas and stuff like that, does a Japanese garden in Arizona look anything at all like a Japanese garden in Japan? Or does it look much more like the landscape of the Southwest? And yet, because of the way it's designed, it is more a Japanese garden than anything else.
That is a question which goes around in Japanese garden circles all the time. What constitutes an authentic Japanese garden? Can a Japanese garden be built in a desert? That sort of thing. There are design techniques. There are design elements. There are different things. The pagodas and the white sand and such that you mentioned are elements, which are standard in Japan. But there are other sorts of techniques like the incorporation of ma, this emptiness, which we find in painting. We find it in music. We also find it in gardens. So you can design a Japanese garden in Arizona, in a desert climate, that has all of the balance, the limited palette, the limited color scheme, all of this sort of thing, including certain conceptual concepts, but doesn't use any of the moss or pines or things that you would find in Japan.
Right. Do you find that idea spreading at all? Or if someone is, say, in Arizona and says, I want a Japanese garden, much more what they have in mind is something that they might find in a Kyoto temple?
I think most people around the world, when they think of Japanese gardens, they think of the classical gardens that were built from the 1700s until the present day. So there's a pond and a stream and a pine and a maple and a bridge or a lantern or things like that. That is overwhelmingly the main image of what a Japanese garden is. And it's a beautiful one. And it's one that can be done if you have a skilled person who can not only build it, but can maintain it. Because the garden is only 50% design, and it's 50% design through maintenance, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
So that's possible to do. My own interest is more in breaking down what the garden's really about, the essentials, and rebuilding it in new forms or new conceptual forms. Now,
you've written, of course, a lot about Japanese gardens. I mean, just from talking to you, you're obviously very well schooled, very erudite, know a lot about the history. And some of the books you've written have been historical. The Japanese Tea Garden book on sakuteki and whatnot. But a lot of what you write is also very literary, it's philosophical, very personal. And one of the things I've noticed, because I've worked on a couple of your books, those kinds of books, is that you start with a single point and you kind of expand outward into all sorts of different areas. You talk about, what makes us human. You talk about nature, technology, sociology, how people live in cities, space exploration or something. I wonder if it's like at the end of the day, you have you have so many different areas that you write about. Do you feel that you're getting at anything in particular? I don't want to pin you down or anything, but is there some sort of almost a kind of a Buddhist sense of the universe being in each atom and then in every one of us? Is that a fair thing to say?
I don't know about the universe being in each atom, but yes, there is a kind of an underlying theme to my interests. And if I had to say it in a word, which is always going to be a little bit limiting, it would be this concept of emptiness, the Buddhist concept of emptiness. What the Buddhist concept of emptiness is pointing out is that all things in the world are in constant state of influencing other things. They are influencing and being influenced by other things. And because of that, these things come into being and go out of being. They grow and they get larger, or they start breaking down and they disappear. So everything is always in a constant state of flux. Because of this, if you say it in reverse, you could say that there is no such thing as a permanent thing. And that is expressed with the concept, the world is empty of permanence. That's how we say emptiness. So when you say emptiness, you're not talking about there being no meaning or like a nihilism, and you're not talking about the fact that when you break apart things on the inside at the atomic level, it's actually quite empty. That's not the kind of emptiness. The word empty is really referring to this constant web of interactions and flux that all things are passing through. So a lot of my writing, especially the essays that are somewhat waxing philosophic, often look at the interconnections between things. You mentioned philosophy and sociology and economics and nature and art. So that's the way I see things, is on this, how are things influencing each other and causing each other to be?
So what's an example of how you might build that notion of emptiness into a garden? Before we began recording, you were talking about a garden that you're building at Honein in Kyoto, and I think you touched on that a little bit.
Right. So Honein is a temple on the east side of Kyoto, and it is known for supporting the artists. They have exhibitions there, and also environmental movements. They do a lot of work with environmental movements. And I've been involved with that temple for decades. Inside the temple, there's a courtyard that has almost nothing in it. It has 3 old camellia trees, and the ground is covered with a field of white sand. That's all. What I'm adding is very little. I'm creating what's like a very thin river that moves through the white sand. The river is made of carbon. It's made out of charcoal, which is almost pure carbon. When I say charcoal, I don't mean the briquettes that Americans use for their barbecue. I mean charcoal that's made from a live oak tree. So it looks like little pure black branches of carbon. And that makes a river going across the whole garden. So what is that river and how is it related to emptiness? Well, again, the concept of emptiness is talking about flux and how things move from one state to another. And in the natural world, one very clear example of that is the carbon cycle, how air, carbon dioxide, gets incorporated into plants. Animals eat those plants. Animals then either through breathing, exhaling, or by dying and breaking apart, they return that carbon to the environment. Carbon is always moving through different forms in the world. This line of carbon that moves through the garden represents the carbon cycle. And the carbon cycle is one example of, quote unquote, emptiness in the natural world. It represents how things flow through the natural world, changing form from one thing to the next.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, because it struck me, you were talking about everything being in flux and being a process of change and always changing. And yet, you're talking about creating the karesansui gardens, which are basically rock and sand, and they don't change. I mean, maybe they change a little bit, but they certainly don't grow. They need to be maintained and kept clean. But the idea is to keep them basically unchanged. So how do you build change, or how do you suggest change with something that is fundamentally unchanging?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are other garden forms that revel in evanescence. So they have plum trees, which flower only for a week, or other kinds of plants or other moving water, things that are in constant motion, much more clear that way, this idea of change and flux and motion. The gardens, these karesansui gardens, do not have that visual change happening, but neither does a painting. And yet paintings of the landscape and of natural worlds evoke in us many different thoughts. The garden and these paintings, they're constant inspiration of the way people think about things. They are not examples of constant change in and of themselves, but they represent the story of constant change.
A catalyst for an active human imagination, perhaps.
Of course, right.
Yeah.
And of course, even the mountain, to get back to mountains, which we see as being the absolute most stable thing in the world. It's there. It's always there. It was there 1,000 years ago. It'll be there in 1,000 years. Even the mountain is constantly changing. It's just that we live such a short time, we don't see that. But if you were to look at the landscape over a period of, say, 10 million years, you would see that the landscape is actually rolling and changing like a wave. Mountains rising and then subsiding and rising again and subsiding. So, in fact, the garden that I built in San Francisco is called the Stone Wave Garden because it captures this actual, real wave motion that we don't see in the landscape because it's happening way too slowly, but it's there. It's just, it's happening at an oscillation that we can't sense.
In San Francisco, of course, they might have the earthquake. That
yeah, you get the feeling that it's there from time to time. Absolutely. Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
I guess we were talking about this a little bit before. I'm just kind of curious about how you kind of get beyond the cliches of Japanese gardening and educate your clientele to want something maybe more sophisticated, more evolutionary, as opposed to just a representation of the classical. Does it really rely on you finding the right client who's just in the right place at the right time and maybe who has enough money to do these kinds of things?
Yes, it is a rarefied practice, and it takes the right person who understands or is interested in that sort of thing. It's my chosen path. That's what I do. Yeah.
Well, of course, you don't make things easy for yourself, do you?
No, of course not.
Do you have any people that you work with, a crew, or have you taken on any students yourself?
In my studio, I don't have any staff. I've never had an assistant or a staff, and I don't think I will. Just the way I do my practice has always just been more like a painter in their studio than an office, However, on every project that I build, there's always a gardening crew that's hired to do the installation. Sometimes people I know and have worked with before, and sometimes, quite often, someone new, because I'm in a new city, in a new place, and I have to work with new people. So I always have a very intimate, ongoing relationship with the crew that builds the garden, but I don't have that in my studio.
Right. And in Kyoto, your crew are people you've worked with before?
Mostly. It depends. On a new project, there may be a gardening crew that was requested by the owner, or if there's a new building going up, it may be that the construction company of the project itself had requested that a certain landscape company be used. I can work with almost anyone as long as they have a certain level of skills.
Well, when you're working out of Japan and you're working with, say, crew members who have no experience with the kind of materials, do you really have to be very hands-on on the site all the time, directing everything?
Yes, and I am anyway. Some landscape architects, some garden designers, because of who they are and how they work and the nature of their design, can do drawings and pretty much hand those drawings over to someone else to build because they're quite accurate. And the materials being used are cut to fit, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But the gardens that I'm building are made out of natural materials, often things that I don't quite know what they're going to be until I go find them. And when I find them, things begin to change. Oh, I see, I have this stone now and that tree now. So the garden takes shape as it's being built. So I do drawings for the gardens, and they may be 70% accurate. And then on site, there's another 30% where I make changes and adjustments and introduce new things as I'm building the garden. I don't do most of the physical work on a garden because it takes a crew of 3 or 10 people to do, but I'm always on site for anything that requires a personal decision.
Do you have a challenge finding, say, the proper stones?
When we're working outside of Japan, in Kyoto, you've got anything you need here. You have all the materials, you have all the skill sets of all the people. It's like cooking in Lyon or making fabric fashion in Milano or something like that. It's this
right.
age-old town that has all of what you need. And here for gardens, that's true. But overseas, that doesn't exist. So what people will expect is to go to the Home Depot or something like a Home Depot and go buy materials. And I'm always saying, can we go to the river and get our stones at the river or in the mountains? Or, can we field collect plants, that sort of thing, to find things that are not standardized?
Yeah, I mean, how do you know where to look? I mean, do you actually go to rivers and find stones and dig them up there and in the dead of night and run away with them?
Exactly, in the dead of night, right? Running from the sheriff. It is true that in the States, more and more riverbeds, for instance, are protected and you can't collect like that. That's true. But for instance, the garden I mentioned called Still Point that embodies the concept of singularity was made out of these flat stones about the size of your palm, your hand, There was a river in the countryside near Ithaca, where I was living at the time, that was a dry river. It only had water in it during a storm. And other than that, it was a dry riverbed. And it was filled with these flat stones. And it happened to be on the property of a friend. So I went there with a crew of 3 or 4 people and a whole bunch of buckets. And we collected, for a day and a half, flat stones from this dry riverbed to use in that garden.
And needless to say, you had to look at each one and approve it.
Exactly. Well, I actually did pick out 10 and lay them on a board and instructed the people picking them. These are the parameters we're looking for. Right.
Right.
So, size, thickness, color, that sort of thing. And it takes that kind of work to do these gardens, because in Kyoto, you would find a stockyard filled with these sorts of stones that have been collected over hundreds of years, gone into gardens, taken out of gardens, put back into the market, gone into another garden, taken out of that garden, back in the market. That's in the shops here, in the stockyards.
Oh, right. And I guess that's true of some of the big standing stones, all moss covered and everything are like that too.
Everything. Huge stones, gravels, trees, shrubs, mosses, whatever you want. There are any number of stockyards where you can go and find individual, unique, natural materials. That's harder in the States.
Fabulously expensive too, some of those.
They can be. They can be very expensive. And before you go in, there's certain stockyards which they're known for having historical pieces or really excellent rare pieces, and their price will have an extra 0 or 2 on the end of it, without doubt. Yeah.
But the stones will have their provenance noted, right?
Some of them
where
do.
They came from. Yeah.
Some do. Rarely, but some do. Yeah.
Is that right? Really? Huh.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, Mark, this is really fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating not just from the standpoint of learning how these things are actually made, by hand with a lot of manual labor and oversight, part of you, but also a lot of the background, the philosophical leanings behind it. And I guess one of my takeaways is that you have to be very, very thoughtful to do this successfully.
Well, again, most work done in any field anywhere in the world is stylistic, rote copying of a certain style that's fashionable at the time. And most people approach the work as a business, and they do it much more efficiently than I do. And that's fine. I mean, most work is done that way. even here in Kyoto, when people build gardens, most gardens are built without a great deal of the philosophical thought interwoven into them. But for me, that's really what it's about. So that's just my approach to why I build gardens.
Well, it's great. I hope you can keep on doing this for many years to come.
Thank you.
Where can people find out more about you and your work?
My website, which is you will put a link.
I will.
So I don't actually need to try and spell it out now. But my website, the Instagram page, you can scroll down through it and see everything I've done, whether it's writing, the books you've published, my artwork, the ceramics I've made, as well as the gardens. So it's very easy to just scroll down the whole Instagram page and get a quick look at everything I've done.
And we can find out not only the gardens that you work on, but your writings and some of your other activities too.
Right.
'Cause you're aside from being a writer, you're also a ceramicist.
That's right. I have done. There was a 10-year period when I was doing ceramics. I no longer am actively doing them, but there are lots of images of the work that I did on my website and my Instagram pages. Yeah.
Okay, so I encourage everyone to go and check out Marc's site. I will put it in, but it is, what is it in?
My website is M for Marc, P for Peter, Keane, my last name, mpkeane.com.
Okay, well, that should be easy enough to remember. If you can't remember it, check out our website notes. Well, thank you very much, Marc. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you, Peter. Always a pleasure.
And I appreciate all the books you've done.
Absolutely. Go to Stonebridge Press website and check out my books there, 4 of them.
Well, thanks very much to Marc Keane for speaking with us today. And you can find out more about Stonebridge Press at www.stonebridge.com. You can find all of Marc's books, including The Art of Setting Stones, Of Arcs and Circles, Japanese Garden Notes, plus a whole bunch of other books about Japan on many different subjects: language, art, history. We just published a fantastic book on Japanese food, if you're interested in that, plus some wonderful literary fiction too. Thanks very much.